Hello, my name's Dave Johnson and I've written the Stuck series of books. I thought you might be interested to hear this clip from my audiobook, Stuck in Time. In this book, the three Baxter children, Lucy, Robert and James, travel back to 1940 in a time machine. They're looking for their uncle who's gone missing, but unfortunately they get stuck and they become evacuees. I'll explain what an evacuee is. The book is set during the Second World War, at a time when bombs were being dropped on major cities throughout England. So the government arranged it so that children could be sent to live with people in the countryside, where it was much safer. They had to go to school, and unfortunately, they quite often didn't get on with the local kids there. The extract that you're going to hear describes the Baxters' first day at school. If you think that it would be difficult starting at a new school, just imagine what it was like for the Baxter kids. They're used to modern schools, and here they are back at the school in 1940.
Lucy and Robert stood outside the red brick Victorian school, both of them worried about the day ahead. Glancing around, they saw other evacuees also looking apprehensive, who were trying to stay out of the way of a group of boys playing football with some unfortunate boy's school cap. Lucy and Robert recognised the unruly boys from the church, with Spike Monroe and Jack and Kevin McGregor amongst them. Then the school door opened, and an elderly teacher stepped outside and rang a handbell. The football game stopped, and the children started to file in.
"Evacuees," shouted the teacher. "Form a line and follow me."
30 minutes later, Lucy was sitting at a desk looking across to Robert, who was on the other side of the room. It was the first time she had been in the same classroom as her older brother, but at this school there was a greater range of ages than she was used to. Whilst she was next to another girl who seemed very nice, another evacuee who was called Mary Ball, she noticed that Robert had been told to sit next to Fred, one of the boys who were at the church. Everything looked so different from the schoolrooms that Lucy knew. First of all, the room was painted in drab and dark colours. She was used to light, airy rooms with bright colours, notice boards and lots of posters and pictures displaying information. In many of her classrooms, for she was used to moving from one classroom to another for different subjects, the rooms were arranged with several large desks where pupils sat in groups, often carrying out work as a team. Here, however, they were seated at regimented wooden desks, and it seemed they would be at these desks for all their subjects. The desk and chair she sat on were fixed together to a metal frame. Thankfully, she had a back to the chair, but it was still very hard and uncomfortable. She couldn't adjust its position. The school teacher at the front looked really old, but perhaps that was because all the young teachers were fighting in the war. He wore a black gown that was tatty and threadbare over an equally threadbare jacket. His hair was grey, and he had small spectacles balanced on the end of his nose. The whole class had to chant, "Good morning, Mr. Greville," when he entered, and to call out, "Here, sir," when he marked the register. Robert stared resolutely ahead. He could see out of the corner of his eye that Fred was pulling faces at him, relying on the poor eyesight of Mr. Greville, and this was making his brother, Peter, turn round and smirk at him.
"English books," shouted Mr. Greville. "Get out your English notebooks."
Everyone except the evacuees delved into their desks.
"Quietly! Stop banging!" shouted Mr. Greville, to no avail, as many of the pupils repeatedly opened and shut their desk lids, trying to make as much noise as they felt they could get away with. "Quietly, or someone will be feeling my cane across their fingers." The noise subsided. "Now listen." And he started to read aloud from a book. "What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel." "Well, who wrote that?"
He peered over his glasses, waiting for a response. A girl at the front of the class raised her hand. "Is it Dickens, sir?"
"Does it sound like Dickens?" "No, it is not. Surely one of you numbskulls must know."
Very slowly both Lucy and Robert raised their hands. Lucy was certain she knew the answer, and Robert, although less confident, thought he knew too, because it was a line he had heard James repeat when he was learning his lines for a school play. "You boy." "Is it Shakespeare, sir?" "Yes, it most certainly is. And which play, may I ask?" as he looked around the room. This time Lucy's hand shot up, because she definitely knew the answer to this, remembering how proud she had been of James in the school production. "Well?" "It's Hamlet, sir." "Good, yes, Hamlet. This is the play we will be reading. This is the book. You will take turns at reading from it, and the rest of you will listen quietly. Seeing you are so familiar with the works of the bard, you can start." He handed a textbook to Lucy. As her clear, articulate tones rang out as she read from the book with clarity and comprehension, Robert started to have doubts about their recent actions. They should have been trying to blend in and not draw attention to themselves, but they had achieved just the opposite. He could hear the boys around him start to whisper and mutter to themselves. "Silence!" shouted Mr. Greville, and he ordered Lucy to pass the book to Mary, the girl seated beside her. The whispering only continued when, in contrast to Lucy's, Mary's quiet and shy voice stumbled and slipped over the words, losing all meaning and rhythm. "Enough!" shouted the teacher as he snatched the book back and passed it to another pupil. Lucy reached across and gave Mary a reassuring squeeze on the arm as soon as she was sure that Mr. Greville was not looking, and from that moment they became friends. As much as Lucy liked Shakespeare, she felt that sitting listening to her classmates reading aloud, without even having a textbook of her own to follow, did not contribute very much to her learning. Robert lost concentration and drifted off into a daydream very quickly, only snapping back into reality shortly before it was his turn to read. The geography exercise just before the lunch break was more of a challenge. "In this time of adversity," stated Mr. Greville, "it is important that we should stand up and be proud of who we are. So I want you all to write down in your jotters as many countries that form the British Empire as you can remember." Robert broke into a cold sweat. His mind went blank. His pencil hovered motionless over his jotter. He could think of the Roman Empire, not that he could remember how far it stretched. He knew there was an empire in the Star Wars films, but these didn't help him at all. He felt a presence behind him, a sensation almost like a weight pressing down on the back of his head. He realized Mr. Greville was standing right behind him. "You boy! Baxter, is it? Why have you not written anything down? Are you a shirker, a do-nothing idler? You are English, aren't you? How do you think we will win the war with that kind of attitude? If you don't give me the name of a country immediately, you will feel my cane, boy." Robert's brain raced as he struggled to think of a country that might be in the Empire. Then he remembered something he'd seen on the news, some kind of protest with the border between Spain and Gibraltar, sir. "Gibraltar? Is that the best you can come up with? Gibraltar? A little rock in the Mediterranean? Well, that is not the first country I would have thought of. The only thing that is sparing you the cane is the fact that it is an important position for our Navy and Air Force, but you should do better, so you, my boy, will stay in over the lunch break and copy out the names of countries from our empire. Now, you girl, what have you got?" "India, Malaya, Rhodesia, Jamaica." Lucy and her new friend Mary were pressed to the railings in the playground watching Spike Munro. He was among the last few boys left in a game of British Bulldog. It was a game that Lucy had never seen before. Mary had explained the rules at the outset, when there was just one boy standing in the middle of the playground, with most of the rest of the school lined up along the railings facing him. "They've just got to get to the other side. Any as he catches becomes bulldogs too, and he tries to catch the rest when they come back." Spike was proving to be very adept at the game. He was extremely quick and nimble on his feet, and he would wriggle and weave his way through the pack without being caught. It was far too rough a game for the two girls. Many of the other children came back nursing cuts and bruises, but generally there were shrieks of laughter. It was clearly a popular game. Lucy had learned quite a lot about Mary in quite a short time. It seemed Mary was an only child, and her father had been a fisherman who had died in an accident at sea several years before. Her mother still lived by the coast, but because there was a naval base nearby, there was a risk of bombing, so Mary had been sent away. Lucy sensed that Mary wished her mother had moved away with her, but she said her mother had lots of friends at home and didn't want to leave them. "My mother's nothing like me," Mary said. "I'm so shy, but you should see my mother. She's so pretty and she can dance like a princess. Everybody likes my mother. She's the life and soul of the party." Lucy asked Mary how she was enjoying life in Anchester. "Actually, I've been a bit lonely. The couple I'm staying with are quite elderly, and although they treat me well enough, I have no one to talk to and nothing to do." "Well, we have quite a few chores to do around the farm, but when I can, I'll come and see you. I like talking to you." "No one has ever said that to me before. They usually call me nasty names on account of me not being able to read and write very well." "Are you dyslexic?" "What?" "Dyslexic. You know, it means that—" Oh. Lucy suddenly realised that dyslexia might be a condition that they didn't know about in 1940s Britain, and was struggling to think of a way to change the subject when the school bell rang and the moment passed. As they filed in, she realised that she was going to have to think more clearly before she spoke, or she might give the game away. Robert was finding his first day at school very stressful and longed for it to be over. He noticed that some of his classmates knew how to manipulate their teacher so that instead of teaching the lesson, he would begin to reminisce about the time he spent in the trenches during the First World War. "I enlisted," he would say proudly. "I wasn't conscripted. No one had to tell me to go. I enlisted." It didn't take much to get him started. "Was it like that when you were a soldier, sir?" Then his mind was off on its travels back into the past. He would stand at the window, his arms clasped behind his back like an officer, although he was never promoted past the rank of corporal, and he would stare into space and recount his adventures. Meanwhile, behind him, the class would develop into a quiet anarchy. Robert felt a lot of the brunt of this. Paper pellets would thud into the back of his neck, directed by the McGregor brothers behind him, or Spike Monroe would sneak out from the back of the class and jab him in the ribs with a ruler.
So there we leave the Baxter children, struggling to fit in at a new school and encountering the school bullies. At the moment, they haven't come close to finding their uncle yet, and we have no idea how they're going to get back home from 1940. I hope you enjoyed this clip. Goodbye.